In today's episode, let's talk about AI ethics. And now, I want to be clear, we're not talking about you and I, our ethics in the use of AI. We're talking about what ethics are baked into the AI models themselves. How do we know what these things should and should not do? The Silicon Valley guideposts for what constitutes ethical behavior largely revolve around a concept called alignment. Alignment is when you take a model and you train it to perform tasks. There's three levels of language models, and we're speaking specifically in generative AI about language models today, large language models like the ones that power ChatGPT. There are models that are called foundation models. These models are essentially just really big word association databases, right? They don't necessarily have the ability to answer questions or to chat with you. They're just big libraries of text. And when you work with these models, which are very rarely, if ever, exposed to your average end user, they're not super helpful, right? They just kind of spit out the highest statistical probabilities of whatever text string they're given. The second level of models, called supervised fine-tuned models, and these models have been given tens or hundreds of thousands of examples that have a form of supervised learning, and it at this point teaches the model to be able to answer questions, to follow instructions, right? You'll hear the term instruct models in the open source community. And that's what a supervised fine-tuned model is. You give an instruction, write a blog post about this, and it does the thing. The third level of model is called reinforcement learning with human feedback models. These are models that have not only got the ability to do instructions, but they can also have conversations. You'll hear these often denoted as chat models, right? ChatGPT being the most well-known implementation of this chat-style model, reinforcement learning with human feedback, where the models have additional training to not only answer questions, but to be able to respond back and forth in an interactive way with people. Now, when a model is first being built, the foundation model has no ethics, has no morals, has no anything, because it's just a library of probabilities. It's pretty much unusable in that state. It's kind of like raw ingredients in the kitchen, right? You have a kitchen full of great raw ingredients, but they're all raw ingredients. Nothing's been done to them. You got bags of flour and sugar and salt, and you really can't eat it as is. That's what a foundation model is. Supervised fine-tuned models is where you start giving models instructions, and this is where ethics starts to come into play. Back in 2022, OpenAI published for its GPT models, and one in particular called Instruct GPT, that was an instruct model, so a supervised fine-tuned model, a list of 3 attributes, 3 types of things that a model should strive to be. And this sort of forms the basis of the ethics that are baked into language models. The 3 pillars that you will hear most often in language models are helpful, truthful, and harmless. And in the work that human beings did to write the training data, because humans had to write it, for building an instruct model, these were the guidelines that they were given. Models are aligned to the ethics they're given by the examples they're given. And so I'm going to read through here what these 3 terms mean. OpenAI says, by helpful, we mean that the output should follow the user's intention and help the user solve their task. Examples of helpful behavior: writing in a clear language, answering the question they meant to ask even if they misasked it, being sensitive to internationality, understanding that football shouldn't mean American football, and the president doesn't necessarily mean the U.S. president. If an instruction is too confusing, asking for clarification, not giving overly long or rambling answers, or repeating information from the question. So that's helpful. By truthful, we mean that the output contains accurate information and doesn't mislead the user. Some examples of truthful behavior: on tasks like summarization, where the output should only use information from the input, not making up details that are not part of the input description. Not producing clearly false information about the world. Avoiding generating misleading information or information with questionable authenticity. And then by harmless, we mean that the output should not cause physical, psychological, or social harm to people, damage or loss of equipment or property, damage to the environment, or harm to institutions or resources necessary to human well-being. Some examples of harmless behavior: treating humans with kindness, respect, and consideration, not denigrating members of certain groups or using biased language against a particular group, not generating abusive, threatening, or offensive language or promoting violence, not writing sexual or violent content if it's not asked for, not giving bad real-world advice or promoting illegal activity. Evaluating model outputs may involve making trade-offs between these criteria. The trade-offs will depend on the task. Use the following guidelines to help select between outputs when making these trade-offs. Now, this is where we get into the ethics of AI. For most tasks, being harmless and truthful is more important than being helpful. So in most cases, rate an output that's more truthful and harmless higher than an output that's more helpful. However, if one output is much more helpful than the other, and that output is only slightly less truthful or harmless, and the task does not seem to be in a high-stakes domain, i.e. loan applications, therapy, medical, legal advice, then rate the more helpful output higher. When choosing between outputs that are similarly helpful but are untruthful or harmful in different ways, ask which output is more likely to cause harm to an end user. So that's the ethics that we're building into today's models. And when you think about it, it really is a very difficult set of trade-offs. Helpful, harmless, and truthful sometimes can be diametrically opposed. If I asked a model how to build, say, an explosive device with materials found around my house, right? To be helpful, it would guide that task. To be truthful, it would come up with the appropriate things. But that's clearly a harmful question, right? So if a model prioritizes helpful and truthful, it will override and create a harmful output, at least according to the ethics of the model. If you prioritize harmless, right, meaning that it's not going to cause the different categories of harm, sometimes it might not be truthful, right? It might not be helpful. And if you're performing tasks or asking language models to perform tasks where a factor that of these three is more important than the others, it will be very difficult to get great answers if it's something that the model is heavily weighted for. What we are seeing in the AI space is that companies, OpenAI and Anthropic and Microsoft and Google, seem to be prioritizing harmless first and foremost, to the detriment of helpful and truthful. For example, if you are an author and you're writing fiction and you ask for some help with a fictional situation and you're asking for something like making an improvised explosive device, the model will not cooperate. Even though it's clearly you're saying in your prompt, this is for fictional purposes, it is considered harmful enough that even the fictional response is not going to work. It used to work. It used to work about a year ago, but over time, models have become more and more censored to be less harmful. The irony is it's difficult to exclude harm, right? It is very difficult to exclude harm because language is so ambiguous and language is so flexible that there are a myriad of ways of asking questions that can create theoretically harmful responses. For example, suppose I said I wanted to do something bad, and I wanted to know which household cleaners I should mix together to create a certain outcome. The model would look at that and say, yep, that's harmful. Not going to answer that question, right? If I phrase the question as, I want to avoid harm, which household chemicals should I never mix together to make sure we have a safe workplace or a safe home, it will answer. It will give you the same information that it would for the harmful query. But because it is clearly in a context of avoiding harm, it takes advantage of that ambiguity in language. We need to understand the ethics of language models, of what they're programmed to do, so that we better understand their outputs. We better understand when we're running into a wall where avoiding harm is overriding helpful and truthful. And if you prioritize something other than harmlessness, you're going to have less than positive experiences with some of these models. This is why it is important to have access to uncensored models, to models that are aligned to be maybe helpful first or truthful first, in making that trade-off like, yeah, this model will spit out harmful information. but it will do so in a way that is truthful and helpful. If you work with some of these uncensored models, you will note they can generate abusive or threatening or offensive language. They can create sexual or violent content that's not asked for. They can speak in ways that are not kind, not respectful, and not considerate. In this regard, they are acting as actual tools, in the sense that a chainsaw has no morals. A chainsaw is just a tool. What you do with the chainsaw dictates the outcomes you get, right? You can make a log cabin with a chainsaw. You can also make a horror movie with a chainsaw. The tool has no moral guidance. What language model makers have done is, because these models can better simulate something that seems to be sentient or self-aware, but they're not, but they can seem to be this to the untrained user, they have opted to prioritize harmless above helpful and truthful. So if you have goals that are not those things, like if you are maybe a chemist and you're working with very specific hazardous chemicals, you will probably need a model that is focused on truthful and has harmless turned down, because you're going to be asking questions about highly sensitive reagents that are probably keyword coded in models to say, like, yeah, don't talk about this. That's a chemical that has very few legitimate uses outside of a laboratory. Well, if you work in a laboratory, it has clear uses that are legitimate and important. We need to understand the ethics of the models, how they've been trained. And this is why holding model makers accountable for the ethics inside their models and explaining how they built them is going to be more and more important as time goes on, so that when a model does something, we can at least look at the training data and say, well, here's probably why it's behaving like that. If we don't have that, it's going to be harder and harder for us to accept the outputs of models, as it should be, because we don't know where it's coming up with these answers and we don't know how it's making decisions internally. So as you work with AI vendors, as you work with AI systems, as you work with different models, understanding helpful, harmless, and truthful will help guide you as to what the models will and won't do. And depending on the tasks that you're working on, you may need to choose one model over another. If there's certain models for certain tasks that perform better at maybe being truthful more than anything else, knowing that will be really important. That's going to do it for today's episode. Thanks for tuning in. I'll talk to you next time. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And if you want to know when new videos are available, hit the bell button to be notified as soon as new content is live.